Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much for coming and being a part of this. Uh, if there's, just in case, Dusty Jansen in Shia, don't understand the Kitlichin in Nishna, Bilagana Bashishin Auto, Honagani Dashichedo, Bilagana Dashinella, I'll Kotego the Nishna. Just in case there's any Navajos out there, and just in case I'm related to any of you, that's me. Okay. We like to do that, and make sure that we extend that relationship and recognize that relationship. I also teach at Utah Valley University, and if it looks like I have Native students in my classes, I introduce myself that way. And a couple of times I'll have students come up to me and say, "Hey, Professor Jansen, you're my Che, you're my grandpa." And I'm like, "Man, I'm only 47. Come on." But you know, they take that relationship, and I probably bought one or two more lunches than I should have for people that are claiming to be my grandkids. But I enjoy that relationship. And on that note, I do want to recognize where we're at here. We're on the traditional homeland of the Northwestern band of Shoshone people. And we want to thank them for their, not only just for their stewardship of this land and the way they've cared for it these many years, but thank them for actually taking part and being a part of this program. And we're going to hear a little bit from Mr. Darren Parry in a minute. But their original homeland, you know, I guess we could say it extended from I-80 up north, you know, and so it's a lot of land that their people would use and have that relationship with. The state of Utah itself is home to 8 tribes altogether. There's, across the United States, there's 574 federally recognized tribes, a bunch of state recognized tribes, but 574 federally recognized tribes that have a government-to-government relationship with the federal government and within the states where they reside. We start off, and we have all their flags here represented behind me. We have the San Juan Southern Paiute, the Navajo Nation, the Ute Mountain Ute, the Ute tribe down in Fort Duchesne, the Northwestern band of Shoshone, of course, the Paiute Indian tribes of Utah, the Confederate tribes of the Goshute and the Skull Valley band of Goshute. All these tribes here that we support and help. And I guess I should have started off with greetings from the governor and Governor Cox and Lieutenant Governor Henderson. They're going out of their way and doing everything they can to better those relationships between the state and the tribes here. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity to do that, to form these relationships. When I think of land and think of land acknowledgement, I remember where I grew up. I grew up in a community called Coyote Canyon, New Mexico. It's just north of Gallup, probably 30 miles north of Gallup as a crow flies, right? It's just in the middle of nowhere. And I remember a lot of things. I remember waking up sometimes and there'd be wild horses in your yard. If you call it a yard, there's no fences, right? Just around your house, kicking at our corral, trying to steal our horses, you know, or even worse, somebody's sheep show up and all these little goats are climbing on your cars and they're putting little tiny dents in your car. You know, my dad would just go crazy. But probably more than anything, I remember the smell of the land and vegetation right before it rains. It was so strong, and I missed that really bad. I miss playing outside with my cousins and then just that aroma hitting you, and we're like, oh man, we better go in, it's going to rain. It was so strong. But having that relationship with where you grew up is so important. And having this relationship here with this conference, with this coming together, this symposium of how the railroad affected the relationships of Native people with new neighbors, with other tribes, or just with the land. And so how important this is to have and to talk about and to be a part of. So I'm so glad you're here. This gathering, you know, it stemmed from the first gathering on the railroad back in September 2019, which marked the 150th anniversary of when the union of the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroads met at Promontory Summit here in Utah. And I look at the pictures that are part of the program, and Native people have been involved and have been around it to see these things. And I'm so glad that the steering committee was able to recognize the importance of seeing that relationship with Native people. I've probably spoken more than my 5 minutes should allow, but I do want to say, on behalf of the steering committee, our tribal partners, the Ogden Union Station, and really just all of our partners, thank you for being here. And I hope you're looking forward to wonderful breakout sessions with wonderful topics, and I hope those relationships get strengthened just between yourselves, professionally and personally. But thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy yourselves.
Thank you, Dustin, for opening the conference and sharing those wonderful remarks. Good evening, everyone. Leander James Toledo Yinishe, but Ashi Nishle, Kutne Satni Bashichin, but Antni Dashache, Kia Ani Dashanella. And good evening. My name is Leander James Toledo, and I am the program manager with the Utah Division of Indian Affairs. And I just introduced myself. Traditionally, in our Navajo traditions, I'm still learning, so I have a cheat sheet. But again, that is who I am. And it's an honor for me tonight to introduce our keynote speaker, Darren Parry. Darren Parry is a driving force behind the proposed Northwest Band of Shoshone's Boya Ogoi Cultural Interpretive Center, and is a former tribal chairman for the Northwestern Band of Shoshone Nation. And in all of Darren's work, he seeks to honor the legacy of his grandmother, May Timbimbu Parry, who was a respected Shoshone historian. Parry served on the boards of the American West Heritage Center and the Utah State Museum Board. He ran for the U.S. House of Representatives back in 2020. For the 1st Congressional District, he is a recipient of the Idaho State Historical Society Award, and for his work in preserving and promoting the history of Idaho. And he is also the author of the Bear River Massacre, A Shoshone History. And so with that, it's my honor to welcome our keynote speaker, Mr. Darren Parry.
This is easy, I can't see anybody. Welcome to Shoshone country. Centuries ago, the smoke of the wigwam and the fires from the council meetings rose in every village, from the East Coast to the west, to the north to the south, until the train came. The shouts of victory and pains and suffering and the war dances rang through the mountains and plains. The arrow and the deadly tomahawk whistled through the forests and prairies. The hunter's almost motionless movements startled the wild beasts and birds in their lair and nests. To the Indian, the song of the bird was music. The drone of the bee was delightful. The lonely fiddling of the cricket was sweet to the ear, until the train came. The young listened to the songs and the tales of bygone years. They listened and they learned so that one day they might be able to repeat the same. The mothers took time out to play with their children and taught them to love and to enjoy the simplest pleasures of nature and life. The aged sat down with only memories of hunting and killing, feasting and starving and worshiping until the train came. They will soon be at peace and rest in fairer reigns where the Great Spirit dwells, far beyond the sunset in the great western skies. Braver men never lived than the red man. Truer men never walked this land, and truer men never drew the bow and the arrow. They had courage and fortitude and perseverance beyond most of the human race. They shrank from no danger. They feared no hardships. Fear, danger, and death were daily companions. They forgave not injury, neither did they forget kindness. They believed that love and hate stopped not at the grave, but was carried into the life of the setting sun until the train came. The Indian never quarreled about religion. They were taught to love one another and be united in all things and be thankful for the favors they received. They dare not pluck a flower or a twig or herb or fruit unless they ask permission from the Great Spirit through prayer. But little by little, the Indian is vanishing into what you call civilization. He is trying to forget the wrongs done to him and his forefathers. He is trying to forget that once his forefathers owned this great land, that their seat extended from the rising sun to the setting sun. In memory, he can recall the hunting of the buffalo, the deer, and other animals and fowls, that these creatures were made for their use by the Great Spirit until the train came. He can remember that Mother Earth was created to produce corn and plants for his use. He must try and forget the day when the white man came across the great blue waters and landed upon his land. He must remember that his forefathers were friends to these new people and not enemies. He must remember that he gave them a small seat because he took pity on these strangers who were running away from religious persecutions. He must remember that his forefathers gave them corn and meat. He must forget, in return for their kindness, we were given poison. He must remember the strangers calling him brother, and must forget that they only wanted a larger seat. They wanted more land. They wanted this whole country. And then the train came. The Indians must remember that disputes about hunting grounds were generally settled without the shedding of much blood. He must forget about the time that his eyes were opened and mind made uneasy when Indians were hired to fight against Indians, and many of our people were destroyed. He can only recall with great sadness when the pony soldiers gave them warm blankets that were used by soldiers who had smallpox, and thousands upon thousands of our people died. And then the train came. It brings stinging tears to my eyes when you recall the March of Tears from Florida to Oklahoma. We must try to forget the wrongs done to us and strive for better things. We must never forget the teachings of the Great Spirit. The Indian now has scarcely a place to spread his blanket, scarcely a place to pitch his teepee. He cannot roam and rove at will anymore because the trains came. The Indian has been forced to leave his home, leaving the ashes of his native hearth. No longer does he see smoke curling around the wigwam. No longer does he stalk the deer and the buffalo. No longer does he creep upon the fowls. No longer is he going up and down the streams looking for fish because the train came. Now he is told we must have a license. No longer is his chant heard at night. No longer is loud wails heard at death. We must express ourselves in a different manner now. We have to wear shoes upon our feet, feet that would rather roam in soft skins. He must cut his hair now, because that is the way of the civilized man. He must wear his clothing, even though his body cries for less clothing. He must eat food that makes his teeth soft. He is changing slowly because the train came. He is watching and waiting to see the effects of civilization upon men. Will civilization make them truer men, stronger men, or men who will get along with other men from across the great waters? The Indians are willing that their sons serve this new country so that peace may reign. The Indian is moving with a slow step, moving with an uneasy step, because the train came. But before long, he will catch the pace of the white man and move as fast as he does. But first of all, we need to erase the deep resentments and painful recollections that have been a distraction to him. Only in memory can he see the deserted villages and cast a glance upon the graves of his fathers and forefathers. He sheds no tears, utters no cries or groans. There is sadness in his heart that surpasses speech. He is looking forward, but he's going onward. But never for a moment will he forget that he is a Native American, a proud race, a race born with spirit that cannot be enslaved. Although his ways may change, his looks and thoughts will always be Indian. American history was for a long time written and taught as a single story. It was a narrative of nation building that united its participants into this single American experience. It was touted as an American success story, celebrating human triumphs made possible in a society with principles that were based on liberty or equality, or so we have been led to believe. In years past, historians have sometimes ignored or dismissed outright peoples whose experience didn't conform to this master narrative. Ignored were the experiences of our people. After all, ours is a story of decline and suffering rather than one of progress and happiness. As a result, notes historian Frederick E. Hoxie, the Indian story was not the American story, and it is best to leave it out. When our story was told, it was usually portrayed as one futile resistance to the march of civilization. As in the movies, Indian history was little more of a chronicle of hostility towards the Euro-American settlers. The images of savage warriors attacking pioneers became firmly fixed in popular concepts of the past, well documented by Hollywood. When Indians were not killing settlers, their history was usually a narrative of the federal government's efforts to solve the Indian problem. Understanding the past involves looking at history from the viewpoints of many people who have made it over the centuries. Native Americans must be included as a central strand in the history of this great country. After all, the nation was built on indigenous land. Our historical perspectives require us to look beyond the stereotypes and rethink some basic assumptions that we've always had about history. While the Transcontinental Railroad was arguably one of the greatest single achievements in the history of this country, it came at a great cost to Native American communities. It undermined the sovereignty of Native nations, and it destroyed indigenous communities and their cultures. It illegally took land that had been ceded by treaty and gave it to the railroads. It increased the concentration of wealth into fewer hands, and it facilitated the colonization of Western territories at a rapid pace. It also exposed our class and ethnic distinctions that are still very existent in the world today. This is a look back tonight, but more importantly, a look forward to what I hope is a better world. The telegram arrived in New York from Promontory Summit, Utah, at 3:05 p.m. on May 10th, 1869, announcing one of the greatest engineering feats that anybody would ever see. After more than 6 years of backbreaking labor, East officially meets West with the driving of the ceremonial golden spike. Back in Utah, railroad officials, politicians, they posed for pictures aboard the locomotives, shaking hands, breaking bottles of champagne, as the Chinese laborers from the West and the Irish and German and Italian and free slaves from the East were nudged from view. Some saw the railroad as a symbol of becoming and national progress. For others, the Transcontinental Railroad undermined the sovereignty of our nations and destroyed indigenous communities and cultures as the railroads expanded into territories inhabited by Native Americans. The Transcontinental Railroad did more to transform America in a short amount of time than any other event in the history of our country. But it came at a devastating cost for most of our people. You see, humans have great memories for what they want to remember. When you commemorate and you celebrate something like the Transcontinental Railroad, you forget the uglier parts of history, and you only focus on the elitists and the progress of this new nation. But that narrative now becomes the story. It's not a story about what it did to our people, or a story about the laborers who built it and died. It becomes a story about the men who had a vision to transform this nation into their own manifest destiny. In commemorating an event like this, you firm up memory and you create history. When President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, he could not ever imagine the tragic impact that the railroad nor the speed of which it changed the American West. In its wake, the lives of thousands of countless Native Americans were destroyed, and tens of millions of buffalo were nearly driven to extinction. But the railroad did not impact all Native American communities and peoples the same. Some nations resisted, while others worked with the railroad. The Lakota people had always developed a way of life organized around the expansiveness of the plains. As a Lakota writer and political leader, Luther Standing Bear described it, Lakota people moved through their land following the buffalo herds. Moving day was just like traveling from one nice home to another. I love that. When the Union Pacific Railroad was being built, Lakota expansiveness confronted the expansionist drive of the United States. This represented two distinct and competing ways of living in relationship to this land. One being that of a steward, the other that valued ownership, depletion, and extraction for the benefit of few. The Cheyenne experience was different. The railroad disrupted intertribal trade on the plains and broke a core aspect of the Cheyenne economic life. The Cheyenne responded to this crisis by developing annuity economies based on regular payments by the U.S. governments, as were stipulated in treaty. Other tribes found themselves drawn into a closer relationship with the railroad. The Paiute and Pawnee men worked as scouts for the U.S. Army and defended railroad construction parties. Their work provided avenues of wage labor for their people. But it also brought commercial farming and boarding schools to the Pawnee Nation, replacing Pawnee women's agricultural and pedagogical work and relationships. By the end of the war, after deadly European diseases had already wiped out hundreds of thousands of our people, the U.S. government signed more than 400 treaties with various tribes to try to contain the problem. But the gold rush, massive land grants extended to those who were building the railroad, and the pressures of manifest destiny all took their toll. And in the end, almost every one of those 400 treaties had been broken, and millions of lives have been changed forever. At the end of the war, General William Tecumseh Sherman's first command was that of the territory west of the Mississippi River, and his top and only priority was to protect the construction of the railroad. In a letter to General Ulysses S. Grant, he stated, "We are not going to let thieving, ragged Indians stop the progress of this railroad. We must act in earnest, even to their extermination, men, women, and children." After Grant was elected president, Sherman was promoted and replaced by General Philip Henry Sheridan. Sheridan was now in charge of the lands west of the Mississippi, where he adopted his scorched earth policies and philosophy when dealing with Native American tribes. You see, Army troops were well equipped to fight conventional enemies, but the guerrilla tactics of the Plains tribes confounded them at every turn. As the railway expanded, this allowed for the rapid transport of troops and supplies to areas where there was a problem. Sheridan and his men were now able to mount the kind of offense that they desired. The possibility of indigenous resistance to the railroad always posed risks to the investors. And in response, the U.S. government enlisted the U.S. Army to ensure that that resistance could be contained. The Army and state militias enforced the progress of construction through military occupation of indigenous communities, deliberately targeting villages and food sources. It took the form of massacres of entire villages, as at Sand Creek, Blue Water Creek, and Bear River, where more than 400 of our people still lie today. Bear River would become the largest massacre of Native Americans west of the Mississippi in the history of our country, perpetrated by U.S. soldiers. Colonel Patrick Edward Connor, for his bravery and heroic victory, was promoted to Brigadier General, and his statue still stands tall at Fort Douglas in Salt Lake City today. Assassination of tribal leaders also took place, and attempts to isolate their children from families were all part of the playbook. The goal was to destroy the ability of indigenous nations to contest the invasion and occupation of their lands. The railroads themselves facilitated these military tactics by enabling swift troop movements with supplies, even during harsh weather. Despite the efforts by both the railroad officials and the military authorities, indigenous people continued to resist. In the summer of 1867, for example, Cheyenne raids led to the complete disruption of the railroad construction. Massive villages conducted strategic attacks on military outposts, settler communities, and the Overland Trail, completely isolating Denver for a time from the United States. Resistance even continued well after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1873, Lakota took up armed resistance against the Northern Pacific Railroad's illegal incursion upon their lands. And yet, despite genocidal violence and ecological destruction, the indigenous nations invaded by railroad colonialism are still here today, including the Sioux, the Arapaho, and my people, the Shoshones. Some of the Shoshone people worked for the railroads through what is now Wyoming, while others accepted the inevitable and watched, probably with memories of the Bear River firmly in the back of their mind. My grandmother told me that our people were fascinated with the Chinese rail workers. Their work ethic reminded them of a bunch of pile of ants scurrying here and there, always on the move, but always industrious. One of our young Shoshone girls even married a Chinese rail worker and moved to California. But by far the greatest impact on Native American populations was the extermination of the great buffalo. In the mid-19th century, it was estimated that there were more than 60 million bison roaming the plains. As massive hunting parties began moving from the east by train, those hunters shot and killed those majestic bison by the millions, and more times than not, left their carcasses to rot. Colonel Richard Irving Dodge, who was stationed in Kansas, witnessed this slaughter. In his journal, he recorded, in 1871, the buffalo seemed limitless. The hunting was sufficient for the next year. But by 1873, everything had changed. Where there were myriads of buffalo the year before, there were now myriads of carcasses. The air was foul with the stench on the vast plains, which only a few short 12 months before had been teeming with life. A year later, there seemed to be more buffalo hunters than buffalo. The complete extermination of this majestic animal left only a few hundred buffalo surviving in 1895. We believed for a long time that the buffalo would again come to us. Recall a Crow woman named Pretty Shield. But they did not. Crow hunters rode far and wide looking for buffalo, but came back empty-handed every time. Nothing. We found nothing, they told us. And then hungry, they stared at the empty plains as though dreaming. With their food supply gone, Native American tribes were now faced with the impossible choice of starving or moving to a reservation. The Texas legislature, sensing that the buffalo were in danger of being completely wiped out, proposed a bill in Congress to protect this species. General Sheridan was there to oppose it by stating, "These men," referring to the hunters, "have done more in the last 2 years and will do more in the next year to settle the vexed Indian question than the regular army has done in 40 years. They are destroying the Indians' commissary. It is a well-known fact that an army losing its base of supplies is placed at a greater disadvantage. Let the hunters kill, skin, and sell every last buffalo until they are exterminated. Then your prairies can be covered with your speckled cattle." The devastation of the buffalo herd signaled the end of the Indian Wars, and natives were left with no other choice than to be pushed onto reservations. In 1869, the Comanche chief Newe was reported to have told Sheridan, "Me, Newe, me good Indian." To which Sheridan famously replied, "The only good Indians I ever saw were dead." But General Sheridan acknowledged the role that the railroad played in changing the face of the American West. And in his annual report of the general to the U.S. Army in 1878, he acknowledged for the first time that the Native Americans were scuttled to reservations with no compensation beyond the promise of religious instruction, basic food supplies, and clothing. Promises, he wrote, that were never fulfilled. And then he said this, "We took away their country, their means of support. We broke up their mode of living and their habits of life. We introduced disease and decay among them. And it was for this and against this that they made war. Could any one of us expect less? Then why wonder at Indian difficulties?" Native American people felt the outside world rushing in. Red Dog, a Sioux chief, while visiting the U.S. commissioners in Washington, D.C., said that when he was there in Washington, he did not pull a twig from a tree or disturb anything. But Americans entering Indian land did not treat it with the same respect. "This is our country," he said, "and when white men come into it, it makes our hearts beat faster." I think we all have had experience of how that feels. By the end of the 19th century, the United States had achieved Thomas Jefferson's goal in building a republic from ocean to ocean, accompanied and embedded time and time again by lethal epidemics. American expansion to the Pacific brought devastation to the populations of the natives in California and defeated and dispossession to Indian nations who just a generation before had dominated their worlds. As the United States, after the Civil War, grew into this great industrial power, it replaced Plains Indians with ranchers and buffalo herds with cattle, compiling Native American people to reservations to make way for the railroads that united East and West, transported immigrants to Western territories, shipped beef to the Eastern markets, stole native lands, and gave it to the railroad with no right to do so. Too many Americans at the time and since, it may seem that the Native American story was over, but it is not. I want you to know that we're still here. Our languages are still strong. Ceremonies that we've been conducting since the beginning of time are still being held. Our governments are still surviving. And most importantly, we continue to exist as a distinct group in the midst of the most powerful country in the world. We've had a history that has contributed significantly to not just the United States, but to the world. There are not that many Native Americans in the US today, and we tend to get overlooked in many ways. And when we're not overlooked, we tend to get misrepresented. Everything from Squanto to Tonto, I like to say. History on occasion has reduced our people to one-dimensional characters, important only in the sense that we taught the Pilgrims to grow corn. But we are much more than that. We long to be heard and recognized. Our voices have been quiet for a long time, and in some cases we're still searching for our identity. Colonial America, this is what you don't seem to understand. We are Native Americans. My father was Native American, and his father, and as far back as we know. What you don't seem to understand is that we don't want your welfare handouts. Your political positions are meaningless to us, and your factory jobs are what we oppose. We want our sons and daughters, and their sons and daughters, and 7 generations into the future to be Native Americans on our own land, with our own languages, doing our own cultures and our own traditions. This is what we are going to fight for. This is what we are willing to die for. But the fight is not over. We as Native people are still under attack. The completion of the railroad brought change to Utah and the economy here. After the completion of the railroad, the demands for manufactured goods went sky high, and individuals wanted to be paid in gold and paper currency. The railroad also meant that silver and ore, lead, coal, and oil could now be shipped out of Utah for profit. But more damaging than all of that was the significant changes to our environments. The railroad altered landforms in Echo and Weber Canyons by creating cuts, fields, and tunnels. Train engines ignited fires during periods of drought and still do so to this day. The railroad encouraged the expansion of agriculture. As farming techniques became specialized, the use of irrigation increased, altering ecosystems through the redistribution of water from streams to farmlands. And almost all of those archaic water laws still exist today. And it is those water laws that are killing the Great Salt Lake. The railroad encouraged a reimagination of the Utah landscape by the Mormons as less of a chosen place of their faith to more of a place of profit. The mindset still exists today. The proposed inland port will bring large amounts of oil, gas, and coal and other commodities to the Wasatch Front for distribution elsewhere. The air quality of our state is going to suffer. More traffic on our highways, more people coming to work for smaller wages, continuing to extract and deplete our Mother Earth at the exact time that we should be moving away from such practices. Our environment and the quality of life is in peril unless we change our ways and change our values. Western values have always taught us that extraction, depletion, and getting ahead at all costs is really what we should value. Indigenous values teach us that we all have obligations. Obligations to the past, to the present, and to the future. Obligations to our communities. Obligations to each other, to Mother Earth, and to our plant and animal kinfolk. The railroad also brought racial tensions to the forefront against not only Native Americans, but to other groups as well. The Chinese, who came in droves in great numbers from the West, many were hired to work on the railroad. When the jobs ended, they had difficulty finding work. Americans, fearing that the Chinese would take their jobs, proposed legislation and passed the Chinese Exclusion Act that prohibited more immigration from China and in some cases sent Chinese back home to a certain death. That act was not repealed until 1943. But acts of violence have continued in this country against those who always appear to be different. This needs to change. We all need to be better. But ultimately, the story of the Transcontinental Railroad has become the story of this great nation. And in some ways, we as Native people need to respect the story that this nation wants to have told, as well as recognize our role within that story. You see, history doesn't always affirm us. Sometimes history challenges us to think about an uglier past that we'd really rather not have. But that is really the power and the benefit of history. It connects us to the past. It connects us to our humanity and our inhumanity. And it always offers us a way to move forward, especially in a circumstance like this with Native peoples, to move forward in a story that connects us not in the prettiest of ways, but to move forward to this new relationship, which I think is a 21st century relationship based on respect. Respect for the truth and what happened in that past moment. Then, that is when you get the possibility for reconciliation. I'm honored to stand before you tonight and represent my culture here in our homelands. And I hope over the next couple of days we have a wonderful gathering. So welcome to Shoshone country, and I hope you all have a good night. Thank you.
silence. Give me a moment to set up my equipment here. I'm going to perform a song. I think it would help if I plugged it in. Thanks. So thanks for being here. My name is Michael Gross. I'm from the Northwestern band of Shoshone Nation also. Darren Parry is my cousin. I think we're all cousins in one way or another, right? Isn't that how we look at it? I perform music under the name Whisperhawk. I perform original music. And about, whenever the 150th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad took place, 3 or 4 years ago, I was approached by a group of musicians here in Utah that were planning on putting on a production with music about the railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad, and they asked if I would be willing to write something that we could perform from a Native American perspective of the railroad. And I thought it would be a good opportunity to, in my own way, which usually is through music, to tell a 3-minute story through song of how the railroad affected Native American peoples. And so this song is called Black Cloud, and I just recently re-recorded it, and it's actually going to be available, the new version is going to be available on the whatever streaming service that you prefer, whether that's Spotify or iTunes or what have you. That'll be available tonight, around 10 p.m. or midnight is when it will go live on there. So if you're interested in having a closer listen to this song with more instruments, you can check that out. Again, I perform under the name Whisperhawk, and it's one word, and you can just Google me and you can see all the stuff that I've been up to over the last few years. This used to be a sacred place. Used to be our home. Iron horse pierced this holy space. I can see it now. Black cloud, black cloud, black cloud, black cloud. You can make your great machines. You can take this place I can feel the thunder roll, wind on my face, black cloud, black cloud, black cloud, black cloud. Black cloud, black cloud, black cloud, black cloud. Thank you. Enjoy your stay here in Ogden, and I'm honored to be able to perform for you tonight. So we'll see you over the next couple of days.
Another round of applause to Michael. And thank you for joining. Oh, okay. Yeah. So I guess at this time, we'll reserve some time for a Q&A session if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask Darren Parry.
I can't see you, so just blurt it. Seriously. Holy cow. If you don't have one, that's awesome too.
Okay, Darren, is it Eshun? Thank you very much. Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you so much, and thank you, Michael, for that beautiful song too. So powerful. My question that I wanted to ask was, there's so many stories packed into what you shared, but one that stuck out to me that I never really heard of was you said you know a story of a Shoshone relative or someone in your community who married a Chinese worker and moved to California. I don't know how much you can share about where you heard that or how that has been talked about, but I always find those stories of like family and intertwining and connections very powerful, and was interested in hearing a little more about that. And thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I just remember my grandmother telling me, she said our people loved the Chinese. They were different, and they were a minority, and we were a minority, and they always identified with them. But I can remember as a young boy, she telling me about a girl, a Shoshone girl, and I don't think she would have been a relative because she would have said so, but she said she took off with a Chinese rail worker, and that's not the story though. So at the 150th anniversary of the reunion, the governor put me on the Spike 150 committee the year before and called me the night before and said, I want to put you on this committee that's going to plan next year's event, but you need to go to this year's event tomorrow, and you need to wear a period costume. Now, don't worry, if you need a black hat and a coat, just, we can provide that. And I said, well, I'll go, but I'll probably wear a headdress and moccasins and dress in my period costume. And he said, oh yeah, that's appropriate. So I get there and I'm dressed just like I am tonight, but I have my headdress at my side, carrying it, because I thought the minute I put this on, it's going to draw attention, and I'm really not that person. And so, but finally, the Chinese were there, dressed in period costume, the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And so I snuck down closer to the Chinese and felt more comfortable and put my headdress on. Well, for the next 3 hours, I took 4,000 pictures with Chinese rail descendants in this headdress. And the last picture I took, a young lady came up to me, about my age maybe, a young lady. And she said, introduced herself, and she said, I'm a professor at Stanford University. And she says, my great-great-grandfather was here, and he brought back a Shoshone girl to California. And so that's my descendancy. She goes, do you know anything about that? And what are the chances? I mean, there were thousands of people at this event. And the last picture I took was with this beautiful Chinese woman whose great-great-grandfather had taken a Shoshone girl back to San Francisco. And so I just thought, man, there's no coincidences in this world. And so the two of us have been plotting to get together to share notes and perspectives. And sadly, the pandemic and other things have made that impossible. But we still stay in touch, and I think one of these days I'll just have to go to San Francisco and bite the bullet and learn more about her family's history, because it will be a lot more than we have here. And so it'll fill in a lot of blanks for us. So thank you for the question, Farina.
Darren, I just want to say how incredibly forceful and brave and appropriate what your remarks were today. Very almost corrective to the history of Utah and the West. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome. And thank you for giving me the opportunity. When Farina asked me to speak, you both asked me to speak. I speak a lot, but I'm really nice when I speak. Not controversial at all. And that's just who I am. I prefer to build bridges instead of hitting you over the head with hard history. And so that's just the way I am. And when Farina said, what are you going to talk about? And I kind of told her, and she said, no, that's not mean enough. That's not. You got to tell the history and the story. And I'm thinking, well, it's really bad. And so I had a moment there that I'm telling my wife the whole way down, I'm going to talk about hard things. And it's usually not the way I do it, but it actually felt good to talk about hard things. We can talk about hard things, as long as at the end of the night we can say, okay, we all go through hard things, right? And so what can we do together to make this world a better place? That's where we should go. And so, thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Again, let's give one final round of applause to both Michael and Darren. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, both those who are joining us virtually as well as those who are in attendance tonight. So again, thank you for joining us tonight. This concludes our opening reception to the second gathering of the Railroads in Native America. And so tomorrow morning, we will meet back here, and looks like registration will open at 8:15, and the program will begin at 9 o'clock. So if you guys haven't had a chance to grab something to eat, there's some great restaurants on 25th Street, and I guess this will conclude our evening program. And I hope you guys all have a good evening, and we will see you tomorrow morning.